Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Yonah Berman, and on behalf of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah Rabbinical School here in New York City and our community partners throughout North America, it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you to the fifth installation of our Community Shemitah Beit Midrash. We have had a wonderful run of amazing speakers, and tonight that run continues. It is a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Barry Dolinger, and we'll hear more about him in a moment. First, I'd like to mention that for those of you who would like to take advantage of our closed captioning service, please press the CC button, usually found at the bottom of your screens. We also have live ASL, American Sign Language interpretation tonight, provided by two different individuals you'll see bouncing onto your screen. I'd like to thank Matisse and Mark Aronson, as always, for their sponsorship and their wisdom in bringing this wonderful technology to everyone and allowing access to as many people as possible joining tonight's program. In addition, I'd like to point out that our Shemitah Beit Midrash will continue for 1 month after tonight. Next month, we will have the opportunity to hear from YCT's own Rabbi Yissaschar Katz. There will be one final video presentation that comes after that, but also 2 months from tonight, meaning the first Sunday of April, will be the YCT Evening of Celebration, the equivalent of our annual dinner. You'll be receiving more information about that, and since it's on Zoom, we look forward to seeing you right here that night as well. Rabbi Barry Dolinger, who's a friend of mine, received his ordination from Yeshiva University, from RIETS, and has served as the spiritual leader of Congregation Beth Shalom in Providence, Rhode Island for about 12 years now. He's a passionate individual. He is a senior leader of the Board of Rabbis of Rhode Island. He's part of the larger Boston Jewish community rabbinic leadership in many, many ways. He brings so much to everything that he does. Matzahs on demand around the world, kashrut to so many different places. I've benefited from both of those and so many more. He really is an out-of-the-box kind of thinker when it comes to the way that he sees Jewish community, the way that he sees building of Jewish institutions, and the way that he sees Jewish ritual and bringing that ritual to as many people as possible. And a good example of that is the fact that tonight is the first time the congregation Beth Shalom is not having a watch party in Rabbi Dolinger's basement, including beer and, I'm told, vegan wings to go along with them, because Rabbi Dolinger is our speaker tonight. A special shout out tonight to Congregation Beth Shalom. I don't know if you remember this, people who are watching tonight, but 18 years ago, I was your rabbinic intern. Started off on Shavuot and stayed along with you for a year after that. And what a pleasure to have you with us tonight and to see what a great rabbi you have with you now for so many years. You bring so much to your community. And thank God tonight to all of us as well. And I'll also point out that, as many of you know, YCT has expanded out beyond being a rabbinical school alone. We have a program for Israeli rabbis. And we also have a program now for American rabbis and American scholars of Torah in the form of the YCT Kollel for contemporary halachic studies. And Rabbi Dolinger was a founding member, part of the first cohort of that Kollel that met this past summer, partially on Zoom and partially in person in New York City. And Rabbi Dolinger, tonight, as you join us, we hope that you share some of that scholarship with us, bringing ideas of contemporary wisdom together with halakha, together with Jewish wisdom, all together into one. And so I'll ask you to start us off, please, tell us, what is the value added? What does Shemitah, Yovel, the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, the Jubilee, the study of all of this, we're in the midst of it right now, what does that bring to thinking about contemporary issues? For example, the environmental movement, everything going on in the world right now that we care so much about. Tell us more. It's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that overly warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to be with you all tonight. Rav Yonah, people remember your internship well. They recount the glory days frequently. In fact, sometimes they say, why can't you be more like an intern we had 18 years or so ago? It's happened. And so I follow in your footsteps. I see my mother, father, mother-in-law on tonight. And so I'll just give gratitude and shout out to those folks. And then many from Providence, from the congregation and elsewhere. It's a little hometown love. Shout out to Providence and other Rhode Island folk, and then colleagues and friends from all over the world. It's such a pleasure that we get to all learn together various times. I see many time zones here on what for us is a Sunday night. So let's delve right into the question. And that's the question we're really going to be trying to answer tonight. You know, learning, I think you all know, maybe not. There is a famous debate in the Gemara and the Talmud, which is more important, study or action? And the Gemara says that ultimately Talmud study is more important because maybe lidei ma'aseh, it brings us to action. Study brings us to action. That's a comment both about action and study. I could have acted without studying, or I could study without acting. But obviously the rabbis preferred a model where reflection in the form of a Beit Midrash, like this beautiful form that you've created, and I've been with most of these so far, kind of dealing with different issues in real depth, can cause us to act more wisely. And so it's a pause in action, but not to simply be in an ivory tower, but to change the ways in which we might act. And so that's really the hope tonight. So we'll try and answer that at the end. If we can't answer that question in any meaningful way, or don't have a path forward, then we failed, or I've failed. So hopefully we'll be able to get at that. So I thought we'd start with a poem. Let me just pull up. This is a source sheet, and I think it's also in the chat. Has it been placed in the chat? It's on Sefaria, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it after. I'm guessing that we won't be able to cover everything I've put on the source sheet, but I'm hoping that if folks are more interested in this topic, they'll be able to go back on Sefaria or just to reconsider. I thought we'd start with a poem to frame the discussion. And this poem is called Storage by Mary Oliver. When I moved from one house to another, there were many things I had no room for. What does one do? I rented a storage space and filled it. Years passed. Occasionally, I went there and looked in, but nothing happened, not a single twinge of the heart. As I grew older, the things I cared about grew fewer, but were more important. So one day, I undid the lock and called the trash man. He took everything. I felt like the little donkey when his burden is finally lifted. Things, burn them, like a beautiful fire. More room in your heart for love, for the trees, for the birds who own nothing, the reason they can fly. This is a kind of cute poem from the great spiritual poet, Mary Oliver, about keeping things in a storage space of some sort. You can imagine a kind of rent-a-room in one of those ugly buildings that line the sides of highways all over the country. And eventually she gets rid of it. And this kind of duality between things and possessions on the one hand, and transcendence on the other, the ability to fly and be connected to nature, to have space in our hearts. And I take this as a kind of poetic reflection on the rabbinic adage, Marben nechasim, marbeh da'aga. More, Biggie Smalls, always worth quoting, who said more money, more problems, as the sages said. We kind of say that glibly, but in fact, we live in a civilization where we all have more things than in any previous moment in human history. And so this is going to become an important point of examination tonight for Shemitah, and I'm going to define that in a minute. But what is the relationship between our material possessions or ownership generally and our spiritual practice? What is our relationship between our environmental footprint and our connection? A few definitions I think are going to be important. Shemitah or sabbatical. I think people know sabbatical as a thing that academics, professors, and fortunate rabbis with good lawyers to negotiate their contracts get. That after so many years, typically 7, you get time off. But of course, sabbatical is an institution called Shemitah, right? That is every 7 years, the land lies fallow. You cannot do kind of 4 or 5 main categories of things, but most of them involving kind of sowing the land and then harvesting, right? So seeds and then harvesting and then different manifestations of that for crops, for grapes, for trees, other things. But that's Shemitah. And then there's a parallel on Shemitah, Shemitat Ksafim, remission of debt, something that's a political discussion every so often in the United States, which is forgiving of loans. That debt is supposed to be forgiven during the sabbatical year. So we have these two poles, the forgiving, the not working the land and forgiving or remitting all debt. That's Shemitah, it's every 7 years. But then in the 50th year, and we're going to figure out how this interplays, there's something called the Jubilee Year. I think people know Jubilee because she was a character in X-Men, if I recall from my youth, the comic. But Jubilee is a 50th year of some kind of greater freedom where Ukratem dror l'chol yoshveh, you shall call out freedom to all the inhabitants, of course, made famous by the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. I see many people here from Philadelphia tonight. A shout out to you. Your Liberty Bell, in fact, has the key verse for Jubilee. And slaves are set free. Land is returned to its original owner, to its original tribal inheritance, etc. So that's kind of the difference. And the Jubilee is the 50th year. All of the ostensible prohibitions of the sabbatical year also occur during the Jubilee year, but slaves are freed and land is returned to its owners. So it's a dramatic reset or rebirth. We're going to be examining tonight the relationship between Shemitah, these sabbatical years every 7 years, and the Jubilee year as a kind of core examination. We're also going to be examining the relationship between Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and Shabbat, the Sabbath. Shemitah is every 7 years, Shabbat is every 7 days, and they're both called Sabbath, sabbatical Sabbath. Shemitah is called Shabbat, Shabbat la'aretz, a Sabbath of the land. So what is the relationship between Shemitah and Shabbat? What is the relationship between Shemitah and Yovel? And what does this all mean for us? Those are the core questions. Everyone good so far? I realize you can't speak, but you can, the little boxes. Okay, great. So first, I wanted to deal with a technical question. In all honesty, my wife said this part of the presentation was boring and I should leave it out, but I felt that technical Talmudic questions were crucial to any true Beit Midrash rabbinic presentation. And it's kind of a fascinating debate that really, if you want to be informed about Shemitah and go through the Shemitah Beit Midrash, I thought you should know about this debate. And it's a simple debate, really. How do you count? I mean, 1, 2, 3. So Jubilee is every 50 years and Shemitah is every 7 years. So is it that you have sabbatical cycles every 7 years, 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, 49. Year 50 is the Jubilee year, especially, or the Yovel. And then year 51, you return to counting Shemitah cycles again. So year 50 is its own year in time. It's outside of the sabbatical cycle, which happens every 7 years. You take a break for the 50th year Jubilee, and then year 51, as it were, is year 1 of the next Shemitah cycle, and you go on. Or do Shemitahs continue every 7 years? And the Jubilee year is the 50th year. But when you get there, the Jubilee year is the 50th year and year 1 of the next Shemitah year, the next sabbatical cycle. Does that make sense? Does the sabbatical cycle start then or not? Now, I'll tell you, apparently, independent of whatever our Talmudic discussion will yield on this question, the academics tell us that as a matter of practice, they counted every 7 years for sabbatical cycles and did not take a break for the 50th year. My professor friends tell me that so much as this was observed, and that of course is subject to debate how much of this was observed in ancient times, but that there was no break for the 50th year. And so there is a historical consensus. By the way, we'll see that historical consensus entering in even to the rabbinic discussion about how you rule on this question, which is, well, did they do it in a particular way? And what role does that have? So this is our first question. We're going to examine the Talmud inside. It's a little bit technical, but while we're doing it, I want you to be thinking about the question, who cares? Or why does it matter? In other words, why does it matter if we count 49 years, 50 years, Jubilee, year 51, we start the cycle again, or whether year 50 is Jubilee and year 1 of the next sabbatical cycle all in one, right? Why does it matter? I have a thought, but it's very hypothetical. So I'd love to hear maybe in the chat or afterwards your thoughts. So the Talmud tells us, Tanya Idach, this is the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah. So for people who are doing Daf Yomi, you did this a few months. I'm not doing Daf Yomi, but for people who are, I understand you did this a few months ago. So you'll remember it. Yovel.
Right, Dr. Can you just scroll down a little bit on the page, please, so we can see?
Oh, the English.
Thank you. That's great. Perfect.
Is this okay?
Great.
Tanya Idach, Yovel hi, ma Talmud lomar, lefi shene'amar, ekidashtem es nasa chamishim, yachol kashem shemiskadeshes velachas mitzchilasa, kach miskadeshes velachas besofa, yaltitma shem mosipin mechol al kodesh, Talmud lomar, Yovel hi shnasa chamishim atam mekadesh nas hachamishim ve'achas, v'rabanan, Shnas chamishim atamonevi atamone shnas chamishim ve'achas lafuke mid Rav Yehuda. Damar shnas chamishim ola lechan ulechan kamash lalan dela. So we have this interesting discussion. It says it is a Jubilee year, and you should sanctify the 50th year. So you might have thought, and maybe I'll just read it in the English so you have it. One might have thought that just as the Jubilee is sanctified from its beginning onward. So when does the Jubilee year start? It starts on Yom Kippur. So too, it is sanctified on its end onward. In other words, it doesn't start at Rosh Hashanah. It starts at Yom Kippur. So where does it, is it from Yom Kippur to Rosh Hashanah? Or Yom Kippur to Yom Kippur? So the Talmud suggests, maybe you might have thought it's from Yom Kippur to Yom Kippur. And do not wonder why one might think this. We don't regularly add from the profane to the sacred? We always are doing this thing where we add from Kodesh, sacred to Chol, right? We try and extend. So for example, Kabbalat Shabbat, we take in Shabbat 18 minutes before, or 40 minutes before in Jerusalem, and we add at the end, right? We're always adding to holinesses. So it would make sense to say you do Jubilee Year. You might have this, right? We all from holy to holy. Starts on Yom Kippur a little late, so we sure got to keep it a little late. So that's why it needs to say it's a Jubilee year, to tell you that it's the 50th year, but it doesn't extend. But the rabbis don't need this special verse to tell you that it doesn't extend. And that's because of another complicated conversation. They don't need a verse to tell you that the extension of the Jubilee from you extend before and after. They have it as a halacha l'Moshe Misina. It's a tradition. Anyway, the rabbis don't need the verse. We don't need to worry about the whole background why. So they say you count the 50th year as the Jubilee year alone, but you do not count the 50th year as the Jubilee year and also as the first year of the next sabbatical cycle. Unlike Rabbi Yehuda, who says you count the 50th year for here and there, both as the Jubilee year and as the first year of the next sabbatical cycle. So all this is a kind of complicated hermeneutic to set up a debate between the rabbis and Rav Yehuda about how it is that we count. So I just want to be clear. This could be a confusing point. Are people clear on the count? It's either Jubilee is year 50 and the next sabbatical starts in year 51, or Jubilee is 50 and the next sabbatical starts in 50. So it changes when Shemitah is. So how do we rule? Amar Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua. So we have this interesting Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Maybe you're making oaths or other things, and you refer in your oath or in general to the remainder of the Jubilee cycle. You know, I give an example, right? Pretend I swear off X for the remainder of this Jubilee, but you don't actually know when you are in the Jubilee cycle. Does anyone know right now? Anyone on this call have any clue where in the Jubilee count we are? Didn't think so. I have no idea. You have no idea. So what do you do? What do you do? So this Gemara sets up an interesting, we could read it inside, I guess, but the basic premise is they assume that you add 1 year from the destruction of the temple. I guess everyone knows when the destruction of the second temple was. Is that not a matter of some historical debate? Maybe not 70. To add 1 year, they have a tradition that the year, I guess, before the destruction of the temple was a Jubilee year. As many academics and commentators will note, that's actually not what we assume, but this Talmud assumes that. We assume it's like after, but they assumed it was the year before. And so you account for that by adding 1. And then for every 100 years, Vinishkal Mimea Trey, you take from every 100 years 2. So every Jubilee is like 40, it's 49.50, 49.50. So they assume that the Jubilee is not enlarged. It's a 49-year count that happens on the 50th year, but the 50th year doesn't enlarge the count. So this Talmud inherently presumes the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that it's 49 and then 50 is Ola Lakanu Lakan, counts as the sabbatical, it counts as the Jubilee, and it also counts as the sabbatical. Okay. If you've been lost to this point, don't worry, we're going to get to more like tangible matters. But that's just Rashi here I brought just explains this all. It's according to Rabbi Yehuda, this Talmud. So how do we rule? So there's an interesting thing in the Rambam. It's quoted here. Did I get muted?
Yeah, by accident.
Okay, how long am I muted for? All right, so great. So how should we do it? So the Rambam is his own opinion, but let's see what he says. So he describes first how you count, from the destruction of the temple, all that jazz. He says, Aval kol ha-gaonim amru, all of the gaonim, the sages from the Gaonic period, approximately up until the year 1000 said, Shemasoras hi bidehem, that it was a tradition they had, ish mipi ish, person to person, shalom manu ba'osan ha-shivim shana, shebin chorban ba'is v'shiravinim ba'ashini, ala shmitos b'va b'lo yovel, that between the first temple and the second temple, they didn't count the yovel, they only counted the shmitas. And when the temple was destroyed, the second temple, they didn't count 50 years. They just went 7, 7. Query, is that because they rule like Rabbi Yehuda, that you always go 7, 7, 7, 7, 7 until the end of history? You never pause for the 50th year? You have a 50th year, but you don't pause for it? Or is it just that's what they did because they weren't doing a Jubilee year because the temple was destroyed? You don't do a Jubilee year unless everyone's living on their ancestral homeland. So it's not clear, but in any event, that's what they did. They counted 7, 7, Sheva bilvad, mitchila shanasa chorban, from the beginning of the destruction. And this is also how the Talmud rules as a tradition. Here, Kabbalah doesn't mean a mystical tradition. It just means, a received tradition. Okay. Ushnas hashmita yedua hi umeforsemes. The Shemitah year is known and famous. This year is a Shemitah year. It is famous. Tonight there are 69 people here. It's famous. It's like Onim, but Anshe Eretz Israel, and the Israelites, the people who lived in Israel. They just counted 7, etc. Okay, and I just want to bring you to the end of the Rambam here. We rely on this. Anu morin le'inyan maestros ushviz v'ashmantas ksafim shekabbalah v'amaseh amudim gdolim ba'orau v'hen roi lihitalos. It's an important rule in the Rambam, the Rambam's veering from his normal statements to add emphasis here, that he says, and you can rely on this, and this is how you count for everything where this matters. There's a whole cycle of different tithes and taxes that occur in a 7-year cycle. And so whether you pause for the 50th year or not affects everything, right? Whether is it Maaser Sheni, Maaser, what are the different tithes being taken? So the Rambam says that the received tradition and Maaser, precedent, are great pillars of ruling, and it is proper to rely on them. Now the Rambam tells you what should be. Shnat Yovel Ena Ola Miminyan Shnei Shavua. The Yovel year should be its own set-aside year that should not count in Shemitah. So the Rambam disagrees with all of this. Everything we do, he said it's wrong. But first he prefaces it. Notice he prefaces it. He doesn't give you his opinion first also. He prefaces it by saying you should do what they always did, and that's exactly right. And it's all about the tradition. And the tradition is that the Jubilee year counts as part of the next Shemitah year, you should know that's not right.
Rav Barry, before you continue, can you just, I know we're almost done with the source, but can you just zoom in a little bit more, please, so people can see more clearly on their screens?
Zoom in.
From the part that you're reading. Thank you.
Does that
just make it larger if you can, yeah.
Svaria is not letting me, even though I'm
Svaria's not
enlarging
letting you
my
do it.
screen, it's not
Okay.
letting me.
Okay, don't worry about it right now. Thank you for
All
trying.
right. Sorry. Maybe if there's any folks from Svaria on the call tonight, how can we Zoom other than putting it in a Word document? So the Rambam here tells you that his opinion is not like our tradition, that he believes we should pause for the 50th year, but he's willing to go along with the crowd. Okay. There is a famous Ra'avad who disagrees. I'm going to leave the Ra'avad aside for the moment, but I'm going to note this disagreement. He's often misquoted. Every time I've heard it quoted, it is not what I found when I looked at it for this class, but alas, examine that on your own. Okay, if you're lost until this point, have no fear. We're out of rabbinic sources into more modern sources that are going to deal more directly with tangible matters. The reason I wanted to bring that, though, is I think something important. You should know that debate. And also in thought, what is this debate really about? I think it could be. This is very, I'm working on it still. If you hold like Maimonides and like Rav Kook wants to suggest later that it's 49 years and then the 50 Jubilee year is a total pause in some dramatic manner from all of normal life, it comes to represent something much deeper. For example, for Rav Kook, it's going to represent a new messianic world. The new messianic world doesn't start with the next count again. The new messianic world is something entire. So we're building to something very dramatic. So in Jewish thought, the opinion of the rabbis that the 50th year is a year of pause, which I bet is how most people assumed prior to tonight's class. That's a much more significant thought for aspects of Jewish thought, whereas, you know, the 50th Jubilee year starts the next Shemitah cycle as well. I think it's less easy to make drushas, homiletical sermons about the 50th year being some entirely new world order, possibly. And so they might be debating not just a technical reading of verses, but perhaps something much deeper, which is the role of Jubilee a more earthly kind of secular intervention in the regular way of being, or does it represent some mystical, messianic escape or repair or tikkun of this life? What's the relationship between Shemitah and Shabbat? There's a great little book called The Way into Judaism and the Environment by Dr. Jeremy Benstein. I see he's now working on 929, the English version. I don't know him, but I saw today, I started that, so this is a plug, 929. There are 929 chapters of the Bible, and you can go to 929, the website, and they do a chapter a day. I think not every day, but most days. And incredible resources, art, poetry, essays, audio, songs about that biblical chapter. You'll learn the whole Bible in just a few years. And he's, I think, directing the English version in some capacity. For his environmental book, he wrote the following: what Shabbat does for the week, the concept of Shemitah does for the cycle of years. In an agricultural society, a year off for the land is also a year-long sabbatical for most of the populace. Indeed, the biblical Shemitah is a stirring example of an entire society choosing to live at a significantly lower material standard for a year in order to devote itself to more spiritual pursuits than the daily grind. The vision is more revolutionary still with its radical egalitarian thrust. As in the dual theme of Shabbat, of creation and liberation, rest for the world and the social order, here too we see the inseparable connection between agricultural practice that allows natural regeneration and a purely economic idea, which can allow personal and societal renewal. And just to be clear, he's talking about remission of debt, right? So you might be asking, why in Shemitah are there these two kind of things? There's I can't plant and I can't harvest, and also I have to forgive loans. And so we're connecting economics and the environment. We're linking those two things. So what's the problem? Well, these days, who can afford not to work for one full year? And if you can afford not to work for one full year and you're not retired and you're on this call, I know of many fine nonprofits represented on this call but most people have to work for a living, right, to uphold our material standard. So how can we feed ourselves without agriculture for a whole year? How can we share our dearest resources with everybody? Right, that's the rule on Shemitah. Some people even say have to tear down your fences, but the food is for the taking. Food is for the taking. This is a story. We went on a baby moon to Sweden and we were hiking. And in Sweden, there isn't exactly the concept of private property that we have. And so we were taken aback because as we were hiking, we came upon someone's house on a trail in a national park. And the trail kind of went basically through their house. Like their house was on the trail. And we were like, huh, this is strange. Like here, you would never in the middle of a trail in a park come to someone's home, like the walkway leading to their front door and continuing out their back door in their yard. And they're just like, hi, how's it going? Of course, in Swedish, hej, I believe. And so now imagine that for food, the people just come and take your food. That's the real idea of Shemitah. It's not that you need some technical permission to buy food that was sold or was worked by a non-Jew, or the court seized the land and paid the farmers in some complicated economic arrangement. The real vision of Shemitah is everyone just comes and eats everyone's food, right? It's for everyone. And so that's what they're referencing here. How can we share our dearest resources with everybody? Or to make it real, what if your bank account was open and whoever wanted could take your money? That's basically what we're talking about. When seen thus as a problem, which is how we see Shemitah, it's an obstacle or problem. And by the way, right, I see my mother-in-law here, right? Her sister is in Israel and sister-in-law is a farmer, and it's a problem. Like it's hard to live during Shemitah strictly. On Kfar Gidon. Shout out to Kfar Gidon if anyone from Kfar Gidon is watching tonight. When seen thus a problem, Shemitah invites solutions that bypass the original intent, whether the fictitious sale of land to non-Jews or the dependence on food raised by them. The entire observance of the precept has become a subcategory of kashrut. People ask whether food is grown according to the rules, not whether the society doing the producing and consuming is kosher. Right, so we've turned Shemitah into a kosher problem. Is this food kosher? It's like the OU won't certify. So someone asked me, will the OU certify Shemitah food sold outside the land of Israel? And the answer is no, not really, but they will with some heterim, and maybe you should consider that, to have kedushat shvi'it, sanctity of the land. But it's a kashrut question. You go to the OU website to figure out the status of your food. But that's not what the Torah is interested in. It's a radical social vision. It certainly isn't seen as a model for addressing burning social and environmental issues. It's become another source of tension for and among Jews, right? Because we know once we're doing kosher, well then, you're not going to eat in my house and I'm not going to eat in your house. And that's the road we travel. It shouldn't be. Lighthouse Kosher doesn't believe that that's the model. We can build a different ecosystem with trust and transparency, but certainly that's the way it is, right? Is that once it becomes that kind of a problem, then it's subject to tension and debate. It is another wall separating us by degree of religious observance, and the social and ecological significance is all but lost. That's a description of Shemitah lost. Now, Rav Kook has a similar answer to this, but in a slightly different, maybe more mystical vein, which is, what does Shemitah have to do with Shabbat? So just to be clear, this was kind of saying Shemitah and Shabbat are both, Shabbat has two pieces. Yes, it's Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit. It is in remembrance of creation. And so in that way, pausing from agricultural work and other work on Shabbat is remembering God's act of creation and then rest. Ba Shabbat, ba Menucha, Shabbat came and rest came. But also it's Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. It's in remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And the Exodus from Egypt is about leaving slavery. It's the weekend, it's unionization, it's labor protection, which is why in the Kiddush we recite, we note, right, that you cannot work servants, and animals and slaves. We shouldn't have slaves, but when they did, right, you shouldn't work the property. That was the feeling of it. Because that's about Egypt. Egypt is about being a slave and internalizing that experience, and about understanding that humans have dignity and cannot be worked hard for the economic benefit of others. Just the Olympics are occurring now. We have to relate these sources to what, when learning, we got to relate sources to what's going on in life. And China, we're all part of a system, right? So it's just hard to not note. And so I'm going to note it here. The Uyghur enslavement. There are millions of Uyghurs enslaved, and they are responsible for most of the cotton production coming out of China, which is responsible for most of the cotton production in the world, which is most of the cotton in our clothing and our materials. And so most of it is an active kind of genocidal slave labor. And so, the same questions we wondered, like how was the whole world buying Volkswagens in 1942 or whatever, celebrating the Olympics in Munich in 1936. We're reliving it. We're reliving it again. So Shemitah so Shabbos is an answer to that, right? It says that people have dignity and that labor needs to be kind of respected, that humans are more than machines of labor. And so we need a day of rest. We need a day of rest, and everyone needs a day of rest. Not just you, everyone needs a day of rest. Everyone you work with needs a day of rest. There's probably a lot to say about that. Like with people working on computers and work boundaries blurring, we're all great at boundary keeping. So no one's working too hard when they shouldn't be, right? So everyone needs not to work in order to let the soul shine through again. So we're going to see this in Rav Kook. So that's Shabbos and Shemitah for Jeremy Benstein a little bit. And there's something about ecology in there, and there's something about human economics. Rav Kook has a different version. Most of the Rav Kook, so preface, Rav Kook in the land of Israel, trying to make Shemitah work again. You all saw Rabbi Chaim Schaffner's presentation about making, or maybe you did, but if not, check out the video about making Shemitah work again and all that was involved in that. So we don't need to really, I'm not going to get into the history of making Shemitah work again because we had a whole session on that subject. But Rav Kook was really the first chief rabbi of Mandatory Palestine, this great mystic, poet, scholar, thinker, passionate advocate for the people and the land. And he did something controversial. He supported the heter mechira, the sale of land, to make Shemitah possible, that Jews could sell the land to non-Jews, and that would be a way of kind of bypassing the prohibitions. But also he had this kind of burning passion at the same time for the place that the real observance of Shemitah, not the kind of legal fictitious observance of Shemitah, but this idealized version of Shemitah, what it meant. I'm not going to read most of it in Hebrew, even though the Hebrew is beautiful, because I think I'll lose 66 or 67 people if I do it. I'll read a little bit in Hebrew to give a flavor and then go to English for the meat. But if we had all day,
quick time check for you. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that if there are questions, people can place them in the chat. So I'll ask people, if you have questions, you can begin to place them into the chat. Try not to hit the return button yet because it will block the closed captions for some people, but you can be ready to go with that. And we just want to make sure we have that time with Barry as well. So keep going.
This source will change your life. Hashmita, this is the most inspiring piece of rabbinic literature on Shemitah that there is. So if you're going to read something, read this. The English and the Hebrew are all available on Svaria. So that is a new discovery for me. You can check out the introduction, courtesy of Nigel Savage, formerly of Chazon, now on his own retirement sabbatical journey, who has translated it all. Hashmita va'yovel bazmanim mityachasim ze laze k'mo hachama va'levana ba'olam u'k'mo Yisrael v'ha'adam v'nefashot yachas haprat v'haklal she'im b'mutnam atzmi v'yoter chai v'yoter ruchani tzrichim ze laze prat hatzarich l'klal klal hatzarich l'prat. Okay, Shemitah Yovel, you know what they are? They're not 49 and 50 in a debate. They are the sun and the moon. So let's just see this. Okay. I'm in 5 here. What is remarkable, now, Rav Kook, you should know in his classic work, Orot, writes the significance of the Jewish people as a nation. He's a nationalist, right? When nationalism was in and not embarrassing. So when nationalism was something people were proud of, he wrote that the special national attribute of the Jewish people was kedusha, sanctity or holiness, a certain spirituality. I actually think that I wish that were true. I think most people assume that about like India, not about Israel. But Rav Kook really felt that that was the role of the Jewish people. And I do think there's a sort of morality, ethics, spirituality that Jewish people are kind of known for, famous for, infamous for, however you like it. What is remarkable, so he says that in Orot. So this is, I think, this should be cross-linked with that passage at the very beginning of Orot. I'm just referencing it for the scholars. What is remarkable about the Jewish people is its ability to view existence through the lens of holiness. That's the lens. Everything is not about GDP, not about profit. That's our current lens, a consumerist lens. So I'm adding a little to here. No. Sanctity. Not does it make money? Is it holy? How's the economy? Well, we added so many jobs. No. What about sanctity to people's lives? Are people dying of stress and addiction and suicide, or is there sanctity? It knows with the full force of its being, and that's not a fault, that's an observation, right? I'm not faulting people who are struggling. So it knows with the full force of its being that life has the greatest value to the extent that it is infused by godliness, and that a life without a touch of the divine is not worth anything. Even more than that, they know that a godly life is a true life, and life without God is no life at all. This knowledge lying deep within people's soul gives it a unique character and impresses itself on each and every one of her individual members. The light and salvation of each person depends on the depth and force of this imprinting awareness. The value of life is in its godliness. And this is what we say before we read the Torah, right? V'atem hadvekim b'Hashem Elokechem chaim kulchem hayom. You who hold fast to the Lord your God are all alive today, right? Like divinity is the source of life. So you want to be living, tapped into the chi. I think sometimes people understand Jewish teachings better with other references. So like the force or the Schwartz, if you're a comedian, or chi, if you're a martial artist from the East, but chiyut, if you're a chassid, and for Rav Kook, that Tem hadvekim b'Hashem Elokechem, you who cleave to God. That's it. That's life. Okay, I'm gonna go down a little bit here to the point. Okay, the individual shakes off mundane routine frequently. Now, in order to live like that, you can't be stuck doing too many dishes. I mean, you could if you were a mindful master, right? Credit to Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed away recently. But for most of us, that's hard. So the individual shakes off mundane routine frequently every week. Shabbat comes, and so does Ret. Ba Shabbat, Ba Menucha. The soul begins to shed her harsh chains. The Lord has given you rest from your sorrow and trouble, and from the hard service that you are made to serve. The soul then seeks higher pathways of spiritual desire that are consonant with the nature of her source. It is good to praise the Lord, Tov Lahodot Lashem, right? L'zamer l'Shem Chayom, the song of the Sabbath, to sing hymns to your name, O Most High, to proclaim your steadfast love at daybreak, your faithfulness each night with a 10-stringed harp, with voice and lyre together. It shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel, the Sabbath. This is a holy day, when the innate inclination of the people for a godly life emerges from its hiddenness and is a sign for the people that its soul treasure contains within it the need and ability to rejoice in God in the delight of the divine. So Shabbos is a holy day. Shabbos is holy. And it helps you kind of brush off the plaque of the week in this metaphor, right? You get rid of and it allows you to focus on more exalted thoughts. What Sabbath does for the individual, Shemitah does for the nation as a whole. That's what this is supposed to be Shabbos for all of us in a deep way. The Jewish people in whom the godly creative force is planted eternally and distinctively has a special need to periodically reveal the divine light within itself with full intensity. A real holy year, like full sabbatical, no work. Our mundane lives with their toil, anxiety, anger, and competition do not entirely suffocate this creative force. You could get drowned in life. Who's drowning? Burnout, we're past burnout, we're into languishing. So Rav Kook knew about languishing as well, and he felt that people were languishing. But the Yovel and Shemitah practices that could be imagined were responses to the languishing. On the Shemitah, our pure inner spirit may be revealed as it truly is. The forcefulness that is inevitably part of our regular public lives lessens our moral refinement. There's always a tension between the idea of listening to the voice inside us that calls us to be kind, truthful, and merciful, and the conflict, compulsion, and pressure to be unyielding that surround bullying, selling, and acquiring things. Look, if you've got to exist in the world, you got to get on the subway in Manhattan, you got to knock someone over to get on. There's just no other way to do it. You're going to be in business. Even if you're kind and honest, other people are going to be trying to trick you, and you're going to be trying to figure out how not to get taken advantage of, right? It's just hard to be nice, or nice guys finish last, says your book. And so since that's true, you've got to step out of that sometimes to really allow moral refinement and your true self to shine through. It's really hard to do. So Rabbi Leah Sarna had a thing about escaping in the cave, the prior system. I'm going to just footnote that whole session. These aspects of the world of action distance us from the divine light and prevent its being discerned in the public life of the nation. The distancing also permeates the morality of individuals like poison. Poison. The distance we feel is like poison, stilling the tumult of social life from time to time in certain predictable ways. We just did that, by the way, in a really odd way. But at the beginning of the pandemic, we did still the tumult of social life. I was like, you would have read this 10 years ago. How could we all kind of like still the tumult? Now, there was still tumult, but we still the tumult of social life. We did do that. But this is in predictable ways, not chaotic, terrifying ways, and is meant to move this nation when it had a little of that effect for a lot of people, when it is well ordered to rise toward an encounter with the heights of its other inner moral and spiritual life. They touch the divine qualities inside them that transcend all the stratagems of the social order. Okay, go on. So Shemitah does this thing. It's like a Shabbos for life. The people in the land both need you need Shabbos. The land needs Shabbos. It's an environmental need too. Okay, I'll just read this last piece from Rav Kook and then I'll move on to two other things to finish. A year of peace and quiet where there are no tyrants or taskmasters. He shall not oppress his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. A year of equality and relaxation. Equality and relaxation. Let's just theme from tonight. So for the up of God, who here when there's property, like in Sweden, and no standing on one's rights, and a godly peace will pervade all that breathes. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. You may eat whatever the land will produce during its Sabbath. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers, or eat whatever you want. Listen to this. Pernickety claims to private property will not profane the holiness of the produce of the land during this year. It's holy. The apple is holy. The pineapple is holy. And the urge to get rich, which is stimulated by trade, because you can never satisfy that, because getting money is always about versus having more and then more security and then other people, right? It's inherently competitive, will be forgotten. And that's not all life is about, because you don't live forever and you can't take it with, as it says, you could pass it on. I'm an estate planner as an attorney, but you can't take it with you, I promise you. And I have to remind my clients of that. For you to eat, but not for your trade. You can eat the food, but you can't do business with it. A spirit of generosity, that's a kind of an axiom of Shemitah. You can eat it, but you can't do business with it. Spirit of generosity will rest on all. And then when you can't do business and you can't make money and more money than anyone else and exploit anyone, well, then you can be kind to people. God will bless the fruit of the land for you to eat and not your loss. Human beings will return to a state of natural health. Listen to this, so that they will not need healing for sickness, which mostly befalls when the balance of life is destroyed and our lives are distanced from the rhythms of nature. Now, there's part of this is like not true, right? We know that now a lot more about illness and sickness, but actually the more we know that a large part of this is true, which is that so much of our sickness and illness, be it mental or physical, are intimately related to systems of stress and overwork and inequality, and in some cases, toxins. And we're going to get there in a minute, right? And so, yeah, Shemitah and Yovel and resting is about public health, says Rav Kook. It's about restoring public health because our current way of living isn't healthy. And the Torah is reminding us that this life we live is not healthy for us. It's not good for us. to talk about environmental justice for 1 minute or two. And then at some point, Raviona is going to cut me off. But
maybe make this the last source, and then we have one question in the chat. If anyone else wants to put anything into the chat, we'll try to take maybe 2 questions altogether with the time that we have remaining.
Yeah, so here, this isn't really a source. This is just a tweet from Sunrise Providence where I quoted Shemitah in an environmental protest. So I thought it would be worthwhile. And this was particularly egregious. This kind of will sum up the problems of environmental justice. You know, you probably know environmentalism as conservation, and many people know about its justice component, the more modern manifestation. But what is that? So what environmental justice is about is realizing that it's not just about saving the whales or the trees or the rainforest. It's about that too. But it's that as a society, we all benefit from the power and other things we choose to have, but that the costs of those are borne only by those people who don't have enough political and financial resources to stop it from being in their backyard. So, for example, they were going to add another liquid nitrogen gas apparatus, a large tank that would hold that, to the port of Providence, which is bordering the poorest areas of Providence. Not the only area it could be, but they were going to add it there. And one of the things that was most egregious about this was that they were claiming that since this had been done before, the local community had no right to even have the normal hearing process. And though the school board gets a right to object, the Providence School Board's president conveniently was the lawyer for the liquid nitrogen gas company. You can't make this stuff up. And why was he the president of the school board? Because they ran a campaign for him and installed him as the president of the school board so that their installation would not be objected to. And so it was going to be installed, and that's the protest I was at. And that's what environmental justice advocacy is all about, right? It's realizing that a lot of times the people who are going to bear most of the costs of poor quality air, high cancer rates, other kind of toxic waste, can't afford to fight it. And so there's not, there's great inequality in how the costs of human civilization are distributed. And those costs are almost exclusively, and if you look, it's actually very shocking, distributed in poor areas. And in the United States, those are usually in, Hispanic communities, Black communities, or in the South in rural poor communities, but you get the drift. In other areas, it's different. So, so what can you do? So I've included here 2 different suggestions from law reviews. What can we do about this, right? In other words, how are you going to give poor people tons of political power? They don't have it. Right? And this is a Shemitah question, a real Shemitah or Yovel question, right? So you're looking at what do we know about Shemitah and Yovel? Shemitah and Yovel are about remission of debt, about equality, about public health, about letting the soul shine through. I see you're going to cut me off, Raviona. I'm going to just say the last point. And that's this. And land redistribution. Yovel, the ultimate kind of apex of it is about land redistribution, or returning things to the state they were, where everyone shares equally, and where we have a view that isn't kind of based on greed or power or selfishness, but really transcendent, where we kind of merge with everyone and see everything and everyone equally. So one proposal here in the Denver Law Review, I won't read it all, by Craig Anthony Arnold, is to have proactive zoning regulations where these communities would organize or be helped to organize, ideally organize themselves, not when there's a crisis, like in Providence, when they're trying to install the liquid nitrogen gas tank, but beforehand, to have, first of all, a vision of what they want to do with their own land, but rules for locally unwanted land use. That's a buzz term you can take tonight. You've learned something. A LULU, a locally unwanted land use. Everyone else wants it, but the people that live there don't. It's the opposite of NIMBY, not in my backyard. Locally unwanted land use. So one option would be kind of twofold: a comprehensive community plan, what they do want, and rules that ban certain toxic waste hazards in low-income neighborhoods before it becomes an issue. The problem is poor communities don't usually proactively organize in advance of a problem to fight them because of the resource, right? That's not going to happen. A second proposal in the Fordham Urban Law Journal, this will be my last point other than my concluding sentence. Full disclosure, I was an editor on the Fordham Urban Law Journal in law school. I went to Fordham Law School. It's my alma mater law journal. So this proposal is a little better. It's something called compensation which is that you pay poor communities they get a sort of reparation for being host to toxic waste sites that others don't want. Now, what are the problems with that? And then we'll end. Well, there are at least 4 major moral questions, right? Like, do these commodify things we shouldn't commodify? We don't sell organs on the black market. Should we be selling public health? They're poor. They're going to take the money, but is that how we want to do it? They're only poor because they don't have other sources of funding, right? So this is obscure other societal problems. Finally, are they trading away the rights of the future generation and the children? What about the children and other generations? Also, what does it mean to be a voluntary entry? Can people really enter this kind of an agreement in a voluntary way? So, but these are kind of the best solutions out there, right? Proactive. So if you're wondering, like, what is environmental justice about? It's about it's about thinking about the environment in terms of the people it impacts and kind of centering those people in their own journey towards the kind of safe environment that many of us, frankly, take for granted. All right, I have a really disturbing article here about kind of black market toxic waste in Israel and the West Bank. We won't quote it, but we'll end with a quote from Rabbi Simcha Kraus, who said, I'm not going to play the video, but he passed away and he quoted 3 weeks ago. He was a giant, and he quoted it in the context of the Aguna crisis, but it's about Yovel, and it's true in every context. You should proclaim freedom to all the inhabitants. And he said it like this, so long as others aren't free, nobody is free. Right? What does it mean to all the inhabitants? So he says not all the inhabitants are slaves. What do you mean you should proclaim freedom to all the inhabitants? Half the inhabitants of Israel, most of the inhabitants are already free. Proclaim freedom to everyone. Everyone's already free. No, if there are slaves in society, no one is yet free, said Rabbi Kraus. And he went on to say that if people are agunas, everyone's an aguna, basically. Everyone is responsible for feeling that pain, but in the actual context, it's true. Until we live with a kind of equal relationship to our resources rather than a greed and resource-based one, the uncomfortable truth is that many of us are living based on the cheap labor and exploitation of other people. And we live lives, we all inherently are born into lives of a sort of exploitation that's an uncomfortable, I'm not saying to feel guilty, but Shemitah and Yovel present real tangible kind of regulations like debt remission and land return, which sound politically extreme in a modern American context, but there are proposals, in the environmental justice movement about what it would look like to radically reorient how we view our resource sharing. So the food for thought, and I'm really grateful. Apologies if I was quick, but grateful for the time together. That's the charge. It's a struggle for me, like everyone,
I think that's exactly the point in many ways, and the 2 questions that were asked that we're not going to get to, but both spoke to that sense of combining the real and the ideal. What do we take from this? And so before we take some practicals, perhaps I'll just say, and really with 1 minute left right now, I just placed 2 links in the chat, one to our Shemitah resources on the YCT website, which have the rest of our Shemitah videos there, about 15 videos up right now. And tonight we'll have number 16 going up the next few days. As well as a link to 929 that Rabbi Dolinger mentioned. Today is the beginning of the new Tanakh study cycle, an amazing resource there to have a look at as well, and hopefully people join together in that study. I want to thank all of our different institutions, partner institutions, Porat, Shivat Maharat, the International Rabbinic Fellowship, our various synagogue partners as well. I want to thank Esther and Sarah and Rivka for their amazing interpretation tonight, both captioning and ASL. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Rabbi Dolinger, and I'll end with a 1-second vort for everyone, which is that in our parsha yesterday, we read about the idea of ish asher yidveno libo. It's whatever comes from one's heart that one brings to contributing to building the tabernacle, to building the Mishkan. And in so many ways, what we heard tonight is that this idea of Shemitah is a very big idea. It's very global, very 30,000 feet, if you will. The question is, how do we now bring that down? And it's up to us to see within ourselves and to bring to our own families, our own communities, and then through that to the world around us, this idea of bringing roar, of bringing freedom, of bringing shalom, of bringing peace and goodness to the world. And so as we continue our Shemitah learning, let us keep that in mind, the lessons that we've learned tonight, the sources that we've learned tonight, and to really heed that call from Rav Kook, from Rabbi Dolinger, and from the others who we heard from tonight, to really think, what is that messianic vision that we are aiming for tonight, throughout the Shemitah, and throughout our entire life. We can't wait to see you again next month as we welcome Rabbi Yissaschar Katz, who will join us for our final of our Shemitah Beit Midrash sessions. We'll also have a video presentation with Rabbi Avi Weiss, which will be shared with everyone after that time. But please join us next month as we learn, and really continuation of the session in many ways, partnering with the divine, Chassidut, Shemitah, and healing the world with YCT's chair of the Department of Talmud and Halacha in many ways at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, Rabbi Yissaschar Katz. We can't wait to see you then. In the meantime, have a wonderful night and stay warm wherever you are. Stay safe. Laila Tov.